Close your eyes and let your breathing settle into a gentle rhythm. Tonight, we travel back through the centuries to a time when the promise of America drew millions across treacherous ocean waters, not as free settlers seeking fortune, but as bound laborers trading years of their lives for passage to an uncertain future. Imagine yourself standing on the docks of London or Bristol in the early 1700s, the salt air thick with the mingled scents of tar, rope, and unwashed bodies. Around you, men and women of all ages clutch meager possessions, perhaps a Bible, a worn coat, a letter from a distant relative already in the colonies. These are not the wealthy merchants or landed gentry who would later romanticize the colonial experience. These are the desperate, the hopeful, and the deceived, about to embark on a journey that would bind them to years of unpaid labor in exchange for their passage to the New World. The ship creaks against its moorings as you watch these future indentured servants, for that is what they will become, step aboard vessels that will carry them toward a dream that, for most, will prove to be something far closer to a nightmare. Their stories, largely forgotten in the grand narratives of American founding, reveal a darker truth about how this nation was built, not just on the backs of enslaved Africans, but also on the bound labor of Europeans who found themselves trapped in a system that offered little more than survival in exchange for years of their freedom. Tonight, we will walk alongside these forgotten laborers, feel the weight of their daily burdens, and understand how their struggles shaped not only their own lives, but the very foundations of colonial society. Let the rhythm of history carry you gently into the past, where every sunrise brought another day of backbreaking work, and every sunset offered only the hope that tomorrow might bring them one day closer to freedom. The morning bell tolls in the pre-dawn darkness, its harsh clang cutting through the humid Virginia air like a blade. Imagine yourself stirring on a straw mattress, one of perhaps 8 or 10 crammed into a single room barely large enough for 4 people. The air hangs thick and stifling, heavy with the breath of sleeping bodies, the sour smell of unwashed clothing, and the ever-present dampness that seems to seep into everything in the Chesapeake climate. Your body aches before you've even fully awakened. Yesterday's work, and the day before that and the day before that, has left its mark in the form of blisters on your palms, a persistent pain in your lower back, and muscles that seem to have forgotten what it feels like not to hurt. But the bell tolls again, more insistently now, and you know that regardless of how your body feels, regardless of whether you manage more than a few hours of fitful sleep, the day's labor must begin. Around you, other servants begin to stir. There's Mary, barely 16, who arrived on the same ship as you 3 years ago with dreams of eventually opening a shop in Williamsburg. Her hands, once soft and unmarked, are now calloused and scarred from countless hours in the tobacco fields. There's Thomas, a former craftsman from Yorkshire who thought his skills would earn him better treatment, only to discover that his master cared little for his expertise in woodworking when there were tobacco plants to tend. The quarters you share are a testament to your master's priorities. While his great house, visible in the distance through the small, unglazed window, boasts glazed windows, multiple chimneys, and rooms dedicated solely to entertaining guests, your dwelling consists of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw. The roof leaks in 3 places, creating muddy patches on the earthen floor that never quite dry, even in the height of summer. In winter, the single fireplace provides barely enough warmth to keep the room above freezing, and you've learned to sleep fully clothed, huddled together for warmth like animals seeking survival. You pull on your clothes, the same clothes you've worn for weeks now, since washing is a luxury reserved for Sundays, if at all. The fabric, once sturdy, homespun, has grown thin and threadbare. Your shoes, if you're fortunate enough to still have them, are patched and repatched with whatever scraps of leather you can find. Many of your fellow servants have long since given up on shoes altogether, their feet having grown thick with calluses that serve as natural protection against the rocky soil and sharp tobacco stems. The walk to the fields begins before the sun has fully risen, a procession of bent figures moving through the morning mist like ghosts from another world. The overseer, mounted on horseback, watches your group with the keen eye of a man whose own position depends on extracting maximum labor from bodies that are, in the eyes of the law, nothing more than property to be used until their contracts expire, if they live that long. The tobacco plants stretch endlessly before you, row upon row of broad green leaves that represent your master's wealth and your own grinding poverty. Tobacco cultivation is not the romantic agricultural pursuit that some might imagine. It is backbreaking labor that begins with preparing the seed beds in late winter, continues through the delicate process of transplanting seedlings in spring, and extends through the summer months of constant cultivation, weeding, and pest control. You bend to your assigned rows, your back protesting as you assume the posture you will maintain for the next 12 to 14 hours. The work varies with the season, but it never eases. In spring, you transplant delicate seedlings, your knees grinding into the rocky soil as you carefully place each plant at the precise distance required for optimal growth. The sun beats down mercilessly, and there is no shade, no rest except for the brief moments when you straighten your back to wipe sweat from your eyes. Summer brings the endless battle against weeds and insects. You move through the rows with a hoe that grows heavier with each passing hour, chopping at the persistent growth that threatens to choke out the valuable tobacco plants. The hornworms, fat green caterpillars with an appetite for tobacco leaves, must be picked off by hand. A task that leaves your fingers stained green and your stomach queasy from the constant bending and squinting in the harsh sunlight. The overseer's presence is a constant reminder of your position. His whip, though not always used, hangs prominently from his saddle, a silent threat that speaks louder than any words. You've seen fellow servants receive lashes for working too slowly, for speaking when silence was expected, for any behavior that might be interpreted as defiance or laziness. The law is quite clear. Your master has the right to discipline you as he sees fit, and there is no court, no authority to which you can appeal if that discipline crosses the line into cruelty. Your fellow servants work in silence. The only sounds the scrape of hoes against earth, the rustle of tobacco leaves, and the occasional sharp command from the overseer. Conversation is discouraged, not just because it might slow the work, but because it might foster the kind of solidarity that plantation owners fear. You are meant to think of yourself as individuals working toward personal freedom, not as a collective group with shared grievances and common interests. The sun climbs higher and the heat becomes oppressive. Your clothing, already damp with sweat, clings to your body like a second skin. There is no water available in the fields. You learned long ago to drink your fill at the well before dawn, knowing that the next opportunity might not come until the evening meal. Dehydration is a constant companion, along with the headaches and dizziness that come from working long hours in the brutal heat without adequate fluid intake. Midday brings a brief respite, perhaps 30 minutes to eat whatever meal has been provided. You gather with the other servants in whatever shade can be found, usually under a solitary oak tree at the field's edge. The meal is simple, cornbread perhaps, or a thin gruel made from cornmeal and water. If you're fortunate, there might be a small piece of salt pork or a handful of beans. Fresh vegetables are rare, reserved primarily for the master's table, and fruits are an almost unimaginable luxury. As you eat, you catch glimpses of the great house in the distance. Smoke rises from multiple chimneys, suggesting the preparation of elaborate meals. You can sometimes hear the sound of laughter carrying across the fields. The plantation owner's family and guests enjoying their leisure while you and your fellow servants provide the labor that makes such comfort possible. The contrast is not lost on any of you, though speaking of it aloud would be foolish and potentially dangerous. The afternoon stretches endlessly before you. Your body, already exhausted from the morning's labor, must somehow find the strength to continue. Blisters that formed earlier in the day have begun to burst, leaving raw, painful patches on your palms and fingers. Your back aches with a deep, persistent pain that no amount of stretching can relieve. The sun, now at its peak, beats down with an intensity that seems almost malevolent. You return to your rows, moving more slowly now, each motion deliberate and painful. The tobacco plants seem to multiply before your eyes. No matter how many rows you complete, there are always more waiting. The overseer notices your slower pace and rides closer. His presence, a wordless reminder that rest is not an option, that complaints will not be tolerated, that your suffering is simply the price of your eventual freedom. Disease is a constant fear in these conditions. The combination of poor nutrition, inadequate shelter, contaminated water, and exhausting labor creates the perfect environment for illness to flourish. You've watched fellow servants succumb to fevers, dysentery, and respiratory ailments that might have been easily treatable under different circumstances. When someone falls ill, they are expected to continue working until they literally cannot stand. And even then, medical care is rudimentary at best. The plantation's doctor is often little more than a folk healer, or worse, the plantation owner himself, armed with a few basic remedies and a dangerously incomplete understanding of human anatomy. Bloodletting is common, weakening already debilitated patients. Purges and violent emetics are prescribed for nearly every ailment, often causing more harm than the original illness. Many servants who might have survived their ailments with rest and proper care instead die from the treatments they receive. As evening approaches, your muscles scream for relief, but the day's work is far from over. The tobacco leaves harvested earlier must be hung in the curing barns, a process that requires careful attention to air circulation and temperature. You climb into the stifling heat of the barns, hanging heavy stalks of tobacco from the rafters, while breathing air thick with dust and the sharp, acrid smell of curing leaves. The work in the barns is perhaps even more unpleasant than field labor. The temperature inside can reach well over 100 degrees, and the air is so thick with tobacco dust that breathing becomes laborious. Your eyes water constantly, and you develop a persistent cough that many servants never fully overcome. The risk of fire is ever present. A single spark from a pipe or poorly tended fire could destroy not only the tobacco crop, but potentially kill anyone trapped in the barn. When the day's labor finally ends, you stumble back to your quarters in a state of exhaustion that goes beyond physical fatigue. Your entire being feels depleted. Your body aches in ways that sleep cannot fully heal. Your mind feels dulled by the monotony and brutality of the work, and your spirit bears the weight of knowing that tomorrow will bring more of the same. The evening meal, served in the failing light, consists of the same simple fare as midday. Cornbread, perhaps some beans, occasionally a scrap of meat. You eat quickly and without much attention to taste. Food has become fuel, nothing more. The luxury of enjoying a meal, of savoring flavors and textures, belongs to another life, one that feels increasingly distant and unreal. After the meal, there are still chores to be completed. Water must be drawn from the well, clothing must be mended by candlelight if you're fortunate enough to have a candle, and preparations must be made for the next day's labor. Time for personal reflection, for reading, for any of the activities that might nurture the spirit is virtually non-existent. As you finally collapse onto your straw mattress, surrounded by the sounds of your fellow servants' exhausted breathing, you allow yourself a few moments to think about freedom. Your indenture contract specifies a term of service, perhaps 4 years, perhaps 7, depending on the terms under which you bound yourself. Each day brings you theoretically closer to that freedom, but the days pass so slowly and the work is so grinding that freedom seems less like an approaching reality and more like a distant dream that may never come to pass. You've heard stories of servants whose contracts were extended for various infractions, speaking disrespectfully to the master, attempting to run away, becoming pregnant if you're a woman, or simply falling ill for too long. Each extension represents years added to your bondage, years during which your youth and health continue to deteriorate under conditions that would be considered inhumane in any civilized society. Sleep, when it finally comes, offers little true rest. Your dreams are filled with visions of tobacco plants stretching endlessly under a merciless sun, of overseers with their whips, of contracts that extend forever into an unknowable future. Even in sleep, you cannot escape the reality of your bondage, cannot find refuge from the knowledge that tomorrow will bring only more of the same brutal labor that has already consumed so much of your life. The quarters around you settle into the fitful quiet of exhausted sleep. Tomorrow will bring the same harsh bell, the same aching muscles, the same endless rows of tobacco plants, and the same grinding awareness that you are, in every meaningful sense, a slave in all but name, bound not by chains, but by a legal document that grants your master almost absolute control over your life, your labor, and your very existence. This is the reality of indentured servitude in colonial America, a reality far removed from the romantic notions of willing immigrants working their way toward prosperity and freedom. It is a story of exploitation, of desperate people trapped in a system designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost, of dreams deferred and lives consumed in the service of others' wealth and comfort. As you drift deeper into the rhythms of colonial history, let your mind wander to the summer of 1676, when the accumulated grievances of thousands of former indentured servants finally erupted into open rebellion. The story begins not with grand political theory or noble ideals, but with the simple, desperate hunger of men who had completed their terms of bondage only to discover that freedom in colonial Virginia meant something far different from what they had been promised. Imagine yourself among these newly freed servants, standing at the edge of a small settlement in the Virginia wilderness. You have survived your years of indenture, a feat in itself, given that perhaps 1 in 3 servants died before completing their contracts. Your hands bear the permanent scars of plantation labor. Your back carries the memory of countless days bent over tobacco plants, and your body shows the effects of years of inadequate nutrition and grueling work. But you are free now, or so the law declares, and with that freedom should come opportunity, land, and the chance to build the life that sustained you through the darkest days of your bondage. Yet freedom, you quickly discover, is not what you expected. The land you were promised, the 50 acres that should have been yours upon completion of your service, proves to be either non-existent or located so far into the dangerous frontier that settling it amounts to a death sentence. The Tidewater region, with its fertile soil and access to shipping, remains firmly in the control of the established planters, men who arrived with capital or who have consolidated their power over decades of successful tobacco cultivation. You find yourself competing for work with newer waves of indentured servants whose labor comes cheaper than yours. After all, why should a planter pay wages to a free worker when he can purchase the contract of a bound servant and extract years of unpaid labor? The economic logic of the colony seems designed to keep you perpetually on the margins of survival, never quite desperate enough to indenture yourself again, but never prosperous enough to achieve genuine independence. Around you, hundreds of other former servants face the same bitter realization. These are men hardened by years of brutal labor, men who understand intimately how the colony's wealth is created and who built it, men whose expectations of reward for their suffering have been systematically disappointed. Many have drifted to the edges of settlement, surviving as best they can through hunting, trading with Indians, or hiring themselves out for whatever work they can find. They form a growing class of dispossessed free men, politically powerless but increasingly angry. Into this volatile situation steps a figure whose name will echo through Virginia history, Nathaniel Bacon. Picture him as he might have appeared in 1676, a young man of 29, recently arrived from England with the advantage of education, family connections, and sufficient capital to purchase a substantial plantation along the James River. Unlike the former servants who struggle at the margins of colonial society, Bacon belongs by birth and circumstance to Virginia's ruling class. He is a cousin of Governor William Berkeley, a relationship that should have guaranteed him a place within the established power structure. But Bacon possesses a restless energy and a talent for recognizing opportunity that sets him apart from his more cautious peers. Where other members of the elite see the growing population of former servants as a potential threat to be managed, Bacon sees a weapon that might be wielded against his political enemies. His motivations are complex, part genuine grievance against Berkeley's policies, part personal ambition, and part the natural instinct of a charismatic leader who recognizes that the colonies dispossessed represent enormous untapped political power. The immediate catalyst for rebellion comes, as it often does, from conflict on the frontier. Virginia's rapid expansion has brought colonists into increasing contact with various Indian tribes, and sporadic violence has erupted along the colony's borders. Governor Berkeley, now 70 years old and increasingly cautious in his approach to governance, has attempted to manage these conflicts through a policy of controlled engagement, maintaining trading relationships with friendly tribes while establishing a system of frontier forts to protect settled areas. To the former servants and struggling farmers on the frontier, Berkeley's policy appears to serve primarily the interests of the wealthy traders who profit from the Indian trade. The governor's reluctance to authorize large-scale military action against hostile tribes seems, to these men, to value Indian lives above the lives of English colonists. Their resentment focuses not just on the Indians who attack frontier settlements, but on the colonial government that seems unwilling to defend them adequately. Bacon seizes upon this frontier conflict as the perfect vehicle for his ambitions. In the spring of 1676, he begins to gather around himself a force of volunteers, many of them former indentured servants eager for the opportunity to strike back against forces they perceive as threatening their survival. The promise of military action against Indians provides these men with a legitimate outlet for their accumulated anger and frustration, while offering Bacon the foundation for a direct challenge to Berkeley's authority. The transformation of these former servants into rebels is gradual but unmistakable. Men who have spent years learning to suppress their anger, to endure injustice in silence, to accept their powerlessness as an unchangeable fact of colonial life, begin to discover that their numbers give them strength. When they gather around Bacon's banner, they find themselves part of something larger than their individual grievances. They become an army capable of challenging the very foundations of colonial power. Picture the scene as Bacon's volunteers assemble. These are not the ordered ranks of professional soldiers, but a motley collection of men united primarily by their shared experience of exploitation and their common resentment of the colonial elite. They carry whatever weapons they can find: old muskets, hunting rifles, axes, and knives. Many lack proper military equipment, but years of hard labor have given them physical strength and endurance, while their years of subjugation have taught them the value of collective action. As summer progresses, the conflict escalates beyond anyone's initial expectations. What begins as an unauthorized military expedition against Indians evolves into open rebellion against colonial authority. Bacon's forces grow as word spreads of his defiance of Governor Berkeley's orders. Former servants, small farmers, and even some slaves join his ranks, drawn by the promise of action against their various enemies, and by the intoxicating possibility that the established order might actually be vulnerable to challenge. The rebellion reaches its climax in September 1676, when Bacon's forces march on Jamestown itself. Imagine the scene as these former servants, these men who have spent years bent over tobacco plants under the watchful eyes of overseers, approach the colonial capital with weapons in their hands and the intention of overthrowing the government that has oppressed them. The psychological transformation is as dramatic as the political one. Men who have been trained to submission suddenly find themselves in a position to demand change. Berkeley, faced with a force of perhaps 1,000 armed rebels, initially attempts negotiation. The old governor, veteran of decades of colonial politics, recognizes the danger of the situation and tries to diffuse it through compromise. But Bacon's demands go beyond what the established order can accept. He wants not just authorization for his military campaigns, but fundamental changes in how the colony is governed. Changes that would give former servants and small farmers a real voice in colonial politics. When negotiation fails, the confrontation turns violent. Bacon's forces capture Jamestown, and in a gesture of symbolic destruction that resonates through Virginia history, burn the colonial capital to the ground. The flames that consume the town's buildings represent more than simple military conquest. They represent the rage of men who have been systematically excluded from power, who have built the colony's wealth through their unpaid labor, and who have finally found the means to strike back against their oppressors. For a brief moment, it appears that Bacon's rebellion might actually succeed in overthrowing Virginia's established government. The rebels control most of the colony outside the immediate vicinity of the coast, where Berkeley has retreated with his remaining supporters. Former indentured servants find themselves in the extraordinary position of holding real power, of being able to dictate terms to the masters who once controlled every aspect of their lives. But the rebellion carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. The coalition that Bacon has assembled is united primarily by what it opposes rather than by what it hopes to build. Former servants want land and economic opportunity. Small farmers want protection from Indian raids. Some participants are motivated primarily by personal loyalty to Bacon himself. These diverse grievances create a powerful force for destruction, but provide little foundation for constructive governance. Moreover, the rebellion's reliance on Bacon's personal leadership creates a fatal vulnerability. In October 1676, as autumn settles over the Virginia landscape, Bacon falls ill with what contemporary sources describe as the bloody flux, probably dysentery or typhoid fever. Within days, the man who has held the rebellion together through force of personality and political skill is dead, and his movement begins to fracture almost immediately. Picture the scene as news of Bacon's death spreads through the rebel camps. Men who have risked everything to follow him suddenly find themselves without clear leadership, without a coherent plan for what comes next, and facing the very real possibility that their rebellion will collapse and leave them vulnerable to brutal retaliation from the colonial authorities. The psychological impact is devastating. The possibility of real change, which had seemed so tantalizingly close, begins to slip away. Without Bacon's unifying presence, the rebellion disintegrates with shocking rapidity. Some rebels attempt to continue the fight, but they lack the political skill and charismatic authority necessary to hold the movement together. Others, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, begin to slip away from the rebel camps, hoping to disappear back into the general population before the inevitable government retaliation begins. Berkeley, meanwhile, has been gathering his own forces and preparing for the counterattack that will restore his authority. The governor's response to the rebellion reveals both the fear it has generated among Virginia's ruling class and their determination to ensure that such a challenge never emerges again. When Berkeley finally moves against the remaining rebels, he does so with a vengeance that speaks to just how seriously the colonial elite has taken this threat to their power. The reprisals that follow the rebellion's collapse are swift and brutal, Berkeley orders the execution of 23 rebels, men who are hanged as traitors despite their previous service to the colony. Many more face confiscation of their property, imprisonment or other punishments designed to serve as examples to anyone who might contemplate future resistance. The message is clear. The colonial elite will tolerate no challenge to their authority, regardless of the legitimacy of the grievances that inspire such challenges. But perhaps more significant than these immediate punishments are the long-term changes that Bacon's rebellion forces upon Virginia's ruling class. The rebellion has demonstrated just how dangerous the colony's growing population of former indentured servants has become. These men, hardened by years of brutal labor and embittered by their exclusion from prosperity, represent a permanent threat to colonial stability. Their numbers grow with each ship that arrives from England, and their grievances deepen with each passing year of continued exploitation. The solution that Virginia's planters gradually adopt is as elegant as it is morally devastating. They begin to replace indentured servants with enslaved Africans. Slaves, unlike indentured servants, never become free. They cannot accumulate grievances over broken promises of land and opportunity. They cannot organize politically or challenge colonial authority through legitimate means. Most importantly, they cannot join with other dispossessed groups to threaten the foundations of elite power. As you reflect on the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion, consider how this failed uprising fundamentally altered the trajectory of American history. The former indentured servants who followed Bacon to Jamestown could not have known that their rebellion would contribute to the expansion of slavery, but their actions forced Virginia's ruling class to confront the inherent instability of a system based on temporary bondage. In seeking to eliminate the threat posed by angry former servants, the colonial elite committed themselves more deeply to a system of permanent bondage that would shape American society for centuries to come. The rebellion also reveals something profound about the nature of colonial society and the experiences of indentured servants within it. These men who burned Jamestown were not criminals or revolutionaries by nature. They were individuals who had been systematically exploited, who had fulfilled their legal obligations only to discover that the promises made to them had been empty ones. Their rebellion was not born of abstract political theory, but of concrete experience with injustice, of years spent watching others prosper from their unpaid labor while they themselves remained trapped in poverty and powerlessness. In the decades that followed Bacon's rebellion, Virginia's planters worked systematically to prevent any similar uprising. They improved conditions for indentured servants just enough to reduce the likelihood of rebellion, while simultaneously shifting toward slave labor. They created legal and social divisions between white servants and black slaves, making it more difficult for these groups to unite in common cause. Most importantly, they ensured that former servants had greater access to frontier land, channeling their energy and ambition toward Western expansion rather than internal political change. Yet the memory of Bacon's rebellion lingered in colonial consciousness as proof that even the most powerful systems could be challenged, that even the most oppressed groups might find ways to strike back against their oppressors. For former indentured servants throughout the colonial period, the story of Bacon's brief triumph served as both inspiration and warning. Inspiration because it showed that change was possible. Warning because it demonstrated the terrible price of failure. As sleep begins to claim you, let your mind rest on this image. Former indentured servants standing in the ruins of Jamestown in September 1676, watching the flames consume the symbols of their oppression while knowing perhaps that their moment of triumph cannot last. In their faces, you can see both the satisfaction of revenge long delayed and the uncertainty of men who have destroyed the old order without knowing what will replace it. Their rebellion failed, but it forced changes that would echo through American history, shaping the development of both slavery and freedom in ways that its participants could never have imagined. The story of Bacon's Rebellion reminds us that the colonial period was not a time of steady progress toward predetermined outcomes, but an era of contingency and conflict, when the future remained genuinely uncertain and when ordinary people, even former indentured servants, could still hope to shape the course of history through their actions and their willingness to risk everything for the chance of a better life. Let your mind drift now from the smoke and flames of rebellion to a quieter but no less revealing form of discovery. Picture yourself standing in a Virginia field on a crisp autumn morning in the late 20th century, watching as archaeologists carefully scrape away centuries of accumulated soil to reveal the foundations of structures that have been hidden beneath the earth for 300 years. These are the remains of servant quarters, the humble dwellings where indentured laborers lived, suffered, dreamed, and died, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their existence. The silence of the archaeological site belies the richness of the stories waiting to be uncovered. Each fragment of pottery, each rusted nail, each small personal object that emerges from the earth represents a life lived in bondage. A human being who struggled to maintain dignity and humanity under conditions designed to reduce them to mere units of labor. These artifacts speak in whispers of hopes and fears, of small acts of resistance and quiet moments of joy stolen from lives otherwise consumed by endless toil. Imagine yourself kneeling beside the archaeologist as she carefully brushes dirt from a small object that catches the light. It appears to be nothing more than a worn piece of bone, perhaps 3 inches long and carefully carved. But as the soil falls away, intricate patterns become visible, geometric designs that speak of patient hours spent transforming a discarded fragment into something beautiful. This is a hair comb crafted by hands that spent their days in tobacco fields, but found time in the evening darkness to create something that served no purpose except to remind its maker that they were more than just a laborer, that they retained the capacity for artistry and self-expression even in bondage. The excavation of servant quarters represents one of archaeology's most challenging endeavors, for these structures were built to last only as long as their inhabitants remained bound to service. Unlike the great houses of plantation owners, constructed of brick and designed to stand for generations, servant quarters were typically built of wood, mud, and whatever other materials could be gathered cheaply and quickly. When servants completed their terms or died, these buildings were often abandoned, dismantled for their materials, or left to decay naturally back into the earth. Yet the archaeological record preserves more than we might expect. The foundations, marked by patterns of post holes and scattered brick, reveal the cramped dimensions of these dwellings. A typical servant quarter might measure no more than 16 by 20 feet, yet be expected to house 8 or 10 individuals. The placement of fireplaces, the location of doorways, and the distribution of artifacts across the floor create a detailed picture of how these spaces were used and how their inhabitants adapted to conditions of extreme crowding and minimal privacy. Consider the challenges faced by the archaeologists as they work to reconstruct these forgotten lives. The servants themselves left few written records. Most were illiterate, and those who could read and write had neither the time nor the materials to document their experiences extensively. Official colonial records mention servants primarily in the context of legal proceedings, estate inventories, or punishment records. To understand how these people actually lived, archaeologists must read the stories written in discarded objects, in patterns of wear on tools and dishes, in the distribution of artifacts across living spaces. The pottery fragments that emerge from servant quarter sites tell particularly poignant stories. Most of the ceramics are rough, utilitarian earthenware, the cheapest dishes available, often cracked or chipped from hard use. But occasionally, archaeologists uncover fragments of something finer, a piece of decorated Delftware, perhaps, or a shard of Chinese porcelain. These unexpected discoveries suggest that even in bondage, some servants managed to acquire small luxuries, perhaps through trade, gift, or theft, objects that represented their aspirations for a life beyond mere survival. One of the most revealing categories of artifacts consists of the small personal objects that servants kept hidden from their master's view. Excavations at Martin's Hundred, an early 17th century settlement in Virginia, uncovered a cache of items buried beneath the floor of a servant quarter. A pewter spoon with the initials RH carefully scratched into its handle, a small mirror fragment wrapped in cloth, and a collection of brass buttons that had been polished until they gleamed like gold. These objects had been deliberately concealed, suggesting that their owners feared confiscation but considered them too precious to abandon. The mirror fragment is particularly significant, for mirrors were expensive luxury items in colonial America, far beyond the reach of indentured servants' official wages. Its presence in a servant quarter raises intriguing questions about how such an item might have been acquired and what it represented to its owner. Perhaps it was a gift from a former life in England, carefully preserved through years of hardship as a reminder of better days. Perhaps it was stolen during a moment of desperate longing for beauty in a life otherwise devoid of luxury. Or perhaps it was earned through some unrecorded service or favor, a small payment that official records would never acknowledge. The buttons in the cache tell their own story of quiet resistance and hidden dignity. While servants were typically provided with rough utilitarian clothing, these brass buttons suggest that their owner had found ways to modify their appearance, to add small touches of personal style despite the uniformity imposed by their bondage. The fact that they had been polished to a brilliant shine indicates the care with which they were maintained, the importance they held for someone whose official status granted them no right to personal expression or aesthetic pleasure. Archaeological investigations have also revealed the ingenious ways in which servants adapted their cramped living spaces to serve multiple functions. In quarters where 10 people might share a single room, every square foot had to serve multiple purposes. Archaeologists have found evidence of areas that functioned as sleeping spaces during the night, work areas during the day, and storage areas whenever space permitted. The pattern of wear on wooden floors reveals pathways within these tiny spaces, showing how inhabitants moved around each other in carefully choreographed routines designed to maximize both efficiency and privacy. One of the most moving discoveries emerged from excavations at the Kingsmill Plantation in Virginia, where archaeologists uncovered the remains of a servant quarter that had been destroyed by fire. The circumstances of the fire remain unclear. It may have been accidental, or it may have represented a deliberate act of destruction by servants seeking to eliminate evidence of some prohibited activity. Regardless of its cause, the fire preserved a moment in time, creating an archaeological snapshot of daily life in bondage. Among the artifacts recovered from this burned structure were the remains of a makeshift school. Fragments of slate pencils, carefully hoarded scraps of paper, and a child's alphabet primer hidden beneath a loose floorboard suggest that someone in this quarter, perhaps a servant with some education, perhaps a child who had managed to acquire basic literacy, was teaching others to read and write. In colonial Virginia, teaching slaves or servants to read was often prohibited by law, making this evidence of clandestine education particularly significant. The discovery of educational materials in servant quarters reveals one of the most important forms of resistance available to bound laborers: the cultivation of knowledge that their masters sought to deny them. Literacy represented more than just personal improvement. It offered the possibility of reading indenture contracts, understanding legal rights, corresponding with family members, and eventually navigating the complex world of colonial commerce and law that awaited those who survived their terms of bondage. Archaeological evidence also illuminates the complex relationships between different groups within plantation society. Excavations have revealed that servant quarters were often located in close proximity to slave cabins, and the artifact patterns suggest considerable interaction between these communities. Shared pottery styles, similar tool modifications, and parallel patterns of personal ornamentation indicate that servants and slaves, despite the legal differences in their status, often developed common cultures of resistance and mutual support. This cultural blending is particularly evident in the archaeological record of food preparation and consumption. While masters provided basic rations to both servants and slaves, both groups supplemented their diets through hunting, fishing, gathering, and small-scale agriculture. Archaeological evidence from kitchen middens, the refuse piles where food scraps were discarded, shows that servants and slaves shared knowledge about local food sources, hunting techniques, and cooking methods that their masters neither understood nor approved. The presence of certain artifacts in servant quarters speaks to remarkable acts of cultural preservation. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of pottery decorated with traditional English motifs, suggesting that some servants maintained connections to their homeland's artistic traditions despite years of separation and hardship. Similarly, the discovery of certain types of beads and ornaments indicates that servants of African origin found ways to preserve and express their cultural heritage even within the constraints of bondage. Perhaps most poignantly, excavations have revealed evidence of the ways in which servants attempted to maintain family bonds despite the system's efforts to treat them as isolated individuals. Children's toys carved from wood and bone, carefully mended clothing in sizes too small for adults, and burial practices that departed from official colonial norms all suggest that servants created informal family structures and maintained emotional connections that their masters neither recognized nor respected. The archaeological record of servant quarters also preserves evidence of medical practices that diverge significantly from the crude treatments provided by plantation owners. Excavations have uncovered collections of medicinal herbs, carefully prepared remedies, and healing implements that suggest servants maintained their own medical traditions, often combining knowledge brought from Europe or Africa with information gained through interaction with local Native American populations. These medical artifacts are particularly significant because they represent another form of resistance to master control. By maintaining alternative healing traditions, servants asserted some degree of autonomy over their own bodies and health, reducing their dependence on masters who viewed their illnesses primarily as inconveniences that interfered with productive labor. One of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries related to servant life emerged from excavations at Colonial Williamsburg, where researchers uncovered a series of small caches hidden within the walls and floors of servant quarters. These hiding places contained an astonishing variety of objects: coins from various European nations, small pieces of jewelry, religious medals, pressed flowers, and carefully folded letters written in languages other than English. These hidden caches represent some of the most intimate glimpses we have into the inner lives of indentured servants. The variety of languages represented in the letters suggests the international character of colonial servitude. These quarters housed not just English servants, but also Germans, Irish, Scots, and others who had been caught up in the Atlantic world's complex networks of labor migration. The religious medals indicate that servants maintained spiritual beliefs and practices despite their masters' often minimal attention to their spiritual welfare. The pressed flowers found in these caches are perhaps the most touching artifacts of all. Carefully preserved between pieces of cloth or paper, these botanical specimens suggest that even in lives dominated by agricultural labor, some servants found moments to appreciate the natural beauty around them. The act of preserving flowers, an endeavor that served no practical purpose and offered no economic benefit, represents a fundamentally human impulse toward beauty and memory that survived even the most dehumanizing conditions. As archaeologists continue to excavate servant quarter sites across the former colonies, they uncover new evidence of the creativity, resilience, and humanity of people who were intended to be nothing more than temporary labor units. Each artifact represents a small act of resistance against a system designed to strip away individuality. Each personal object speaks to the persistence of hope in the face of systematic oppression. The archaeological record of indentured servants challenges us to remember that behind every statistic about colonial labor, behind every legal document defining the terms of bondage, stood individual human beings who laughed and cried, who dreamed and despaired, who found ways to create meaning and maintain dignity even in the most difficult circumstances. Their stories, written in fragments of pottery and scraps of personal belongings, remind us that the history of colonial America cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the experiences of those who built its prosperity through their unpaid labor. As you allow these images of discovery to carry you deeper towards sleep, picture those long-dead servants whose possessions now rest in museum collections and research archives. Imagine them in their cramped quarters, gathered around a flickering candle, perhaps sharing stories of their homeland, perhaps teaching a child to form letters on a precious scrap of paper, perhaps simply enjoying a moment of companionship after another day of backbreaking labor. In these quiet moments of human connection, preserved for us now only in the archaeological record, we find evidence of the indomitable spirit that no system of bondage could entirely crush. Let your thoughts drift now across the colonial landscape, from the cramped servant quarters we have just explored to the magnificent structures that dominated the horizon of plantation society. Picture yourself approaching one of Virginia's great houses on a warm spring evening in 1750, perhaps Carter's Grove or Westover, when the setting sun casts long shadows across manicured lawns and illuminates the elegant Georgian facades that represent the pinnacle of colonial architectural achievement. The contrast could hardly be more striking. Where servant quarters measured perhaps 16 by 20 feet and housed 10 souls, these plantation mansions sprawl across acres of carefully designed space, their rooms vast and airy, their ceilings soaring 12 feet or more above polished wooden floors. Where servants may do with rough earthenware and pewter, the great houses display imported china from the finest English and Chinese manufacturers. Where servants slept on straw mattresses in rooms that reeked of unwashed bodies and damp earth, the plantation elite retired each night to chambers hung with silk and furnished with mahogany pieces crafted by London's master cabinet makers. Imagine yourself standing in the grand entrance hall of such a mansion, your footsteps echoing on marble tiles that were quarried in England and shipped across the Atlantic at enormous expense. The walls rise around you in perfect symmetry, their surfaces adorned with oil paintings depicting English landscapes, classical scenes, and family portraits that trace the genealogy of wealth through several generations. Above you, a magnificent chandelier hangs from a painted ceiling, its dozens of candles casting warm light that dances across gilt frames and polished silver. This is the world that indentured servant labor has created, though servants themselves are rarely permitted to see it except as they move through it while performing their duties. The irony is profound and intentional. The very people whose unpaid labor has generated the wealth necessary to purchase such luxury are systematically excluded from enjoying or even fully observing the fruits of their toil. They know these rooms exist, of course, but they experience them only as spaces to be cleaned, not as environments designed for human comfort and pleasure. The plantation owner who greets you at the door embodies the refinement that wealth makes possible. His clothing alone represents more value than most servants will see in their entire terms of bondage. His coat is cut from the finest broadcloth, its buttons crafted from precious metals and adorned with his family crest. His silk stockings are imported from France, his shoes made by London craftsmen who have never seen colonial soil. Every element of his appearance has been carefully chosen to communicate status, education, and membership in the Atlantic world's most exclusive social circles. As you follow him into the drawing room, observe how the space has been designed to facilitate the kinds of social interaction that define elite colonial society. The furniture is arranged in intimate groupings that encourage conversation, while the room's proportions create an atmosphere of both grandeur and comfort. Books line the walls, not the practical volumes that might be found in a merchant's office, but leather-bound collections of classical literature, philosophy, and contemporary political theory that mark their owner as a man of learning and sophistication. The lady of the house joins you, her appearance equally calculated to display the family's wealth and refinement. Her gown is cut from silk imported from China, its elaborate construction requiring the skills of multiple craftspeople and representing dozens of hours of highly skilled labor. Her jewelry includes pieces set with precious stones that have traveled from India and South America to London workshops before making their final journey to this Virginia plantation. Her hair is arranged in the latest fashion, maintained by personal servants whose entire existence revolves around supporting her comfort and appearance. Yet as you converse with these representatives of colonial elite society, you begin to understand that their refinement exists in constant tension with the realities of how their wealth has been generated. They speak eloquently of philosophy and politics, but they carefully avoid discussing the specific mechanisms by which their tobacco profits are produced. They display extensive knowledge of European art and literature, but they show little curiosity about the cultures and experiences of the people whose labor supports their leisure to pursue such interests. The dinner that follows illustrates this same dynamic on a grand scale. You are seated at a table that extends nearly the length of the dining room, its surface set with multiple services of china, crystal, and silver that represent the combined output of England's finest manufacturers. The meal itself consists of multiple courses, each more elaborate than the last. Turtle soup from the Caribbean, beef imported from England, vegetables grown in the plantation's own gardens, but prepared by skilled cooks, whose training represents years of unpaid labor. As servants move silently around the table, filling wine glasses and removing plates with practiced efficiency, you observe the careful choreography that makes such dining possible. These servants, some indentured, some enslaved, all bound to years of unpaid labor, have been trained to anticipate every need while remaining as invisible as possible. They know precisely when to appear with the next course and when to fade into the background, when to refill a glass and when to remain perfectly still. The conversation that flows around the table reveals the intellectual world that plantation wealth has made possible. Your hosts discuss the latest books from London, debate political developments in Parliament, and exchange gossip about mutual acquaintances in other colonies. They demonstrate familiarity with classical literature, contemporary philosophy, and the artistic trends that define fashionable society on both sides of the Atlantic. This is genuine cultivation, made possible by leisure time that the plantation system has purchased at the cost of others' freedom. After dinner, you retire with the men to the library for port and conversation, while the ladies withdraw to the parlor for tea and music. The library walls are lined with volumes that represent one of the finest private collections in colonial America. Works by Shakespeare and Milton, philosophical treatises by Locke and Hume, historical accounts of ancient Greece and Rome, and contemporary political pamphlets that debate the nature of government and individual rights. The irony of reading Locke's theories about natural liberty while sitting in a room built by unfree labor seems to escape your hosts entirely, or perhaps they have simply become skilled at compartmentalizing such contradictions. The port that accompanies this intellectual discussion is itself a product of the Atlantic economy that depends on unfree labor. Aged in cellars maintained by servants, imported through networks that depend on slave-produced sugar, served in glasses polished by bound workers who will never taste such luxury themselves. Every element of this refined evening exists because hundreds of people have been systematically excluded from sharing in the profits of their own labor. As the evening progresses, you're invited to tour the house's other rooms, each designed to serve a specific function in the complex social rituals that define elite colonial life. The music room contains a harpsichord imported from London at enormous expense, along with sheet music representing the latest compositions from European masters. The master bedroom features a 4-poster bed whose hangings alone cost more than most servants will earn in their entire terms of bondage, while the adjoining dressing rooms contain wardrobes that would stock a London boutique. Perhaps most revealing is the Plantation office, where the business of wealth generation is carefully recorded and managed. Ledger books document the purchase and sale of servant contracts with the same precision used to record other commodities. Pages filled with neat columns of figures track the productivity of individual workers, the costs of maintaining them, and the profits generated by their labor. These human beings have been reduced to mathematical calculations, their lives measured only in terms of economic output. The maps that cover the office walls reveal the geographic scope of the plantation owners' interests. Shipping routes connect Virginia to London, Bristol, and Liverpool, tracing the paths by which tobacco travels east, while manufactured goods and indentured servants travel west. Other properties are marked throughout the Chesapeake region, each representing additional sources of wealth generated by bound labor. The scale of these operations becomes clear as you examine the careful notations that track hundreds of workers across thousands of acres. Outside the house, the plantation's physical layout reinforces the social hierarchies that define colonial society. The Great House occupies the most prominent position, its commanding view of the river emphasizing the owner's dominance over both the landscape and the people who inhabit it. Surrounding it are the various outbuildings that support elite life. Kitchens, stables, workshops, and storage buildings that house the specialized activities necessary to maintain such an elaborate establishment. At the greatest distance from the Great House stand the quarters where servants and slaves live, positioned deliberately to minimize their visual impact on the elite family's daily experience. From the mansion's windows, these humble dwellings are barely visible, hidden behind carefully planted trees and screening buildings. This physical separation serves both practical and psychological functions, allowing the plantation elite to enjoy the fruits of bound labor while avoiding constant reminders of the human cost of their comfort. The gardens that surround the Great House represent another form of conspicuous consumption, their elaborate design requiring constant maintenance by workers whose own living spaces lack even the most basic amenities. Formal parterre gardens display geometric precision that demonstrates complete control over the natural environment, while pleasure gardens offer carefully composed vistas designed to delight the eye and provide suitable settings for fashionable entertainment. Every plant has been chosen for its aesthetic effect, every path calculated to create pleasing prospects and intimate conversation areas. As you walk through these gardens in the evening light, you encounter other members of the plantation's elite society. neighboring planters and their families who have come to enjoy the kind of refined entertainment that bound labor makes possible. They discuss literature and politics, share gossip about mutual acquaintances, and debate the latest fashions from London. Their conversation reveals a sophisticated understanding of the wider Atlantic world, an understanding purchased with leisure time that others' unpaid labor has provided. The entertainment that concludes your visit exemplifies the cultural refinement that plantation wealth has purchased. Musicians perform pieces by Handel and Vivaldi on instruments imported from the finest European workshops. Dancers move through elaborate figures that require years of instruction and practice, their movements displaying the grace and coordination that only extensive leisure makes possible. The very ability to spend time on such cultural pursuits represents a luxury beyond the comprehension of those whose labor supports it. Yet beneath the surface refinement of plantation society runs a constant current of anxiety about the system that makes such luxury possible. Conversations occasionally turn to concerns about servant discipline, worries about maintaining adequate labor supplies, and fears about the political implications of depending so heavily on bound workers. The plantation elite understand, perhaps better than anyone, how precarious their position really is, how dependent their refined world remains on the continued submission of people who have every reason to resent their bondage. This anxiety manifests itself in the elaborate systems of control that govern plantation life, the careful surveillance of servant quarters, the harsh punishments that await any sign of resistance, the complex legal structures designed to prevent bound workers from organizing or challenging their conditions. The very sophistication of these control mechanisms reveals how thoroughly the plantation elite understand the injustice of their position and how much they fear the consequences should their workers ever find effective ways to resist. As you prepare to retire for the evening, you are shown to a guest chamber that embodies all the comfort and luxury that plantation wealth can provide. The bed is furnished with fine linens and down pillows, the walls hung with silk tapestries, the windows dressed with curtains that shut out the night air. A servant appears to assist with your needs, their movements practiced and efficient, their manner carefully trained to suggest willing service rather than reluctant compliance. But as you settle into the luxurious bed, you cannot forget that only a few hundred yards away, other human beings are concluding their day in circumstances of deliberate hardship and deprivation. They sleep on straw mattresses in overcrowded rooms, their day's labor completed but offering no prospect of reward beyond mere survival. Tomorrow will bring the same backbreaking work that has filled all their yesterdays, while you and your hosts will enjoy leisure purchased with their toil. The contrast between these two worlds, the elegant refinement of the great house and the grinding poverty of the servant quarters, reveals one of colonial America's most profound moral contradictions. The same society that produced sophisticated political philosophy about human rights and individual liberty also created elaborate systems for exploiting human labor without compensation. The same planters who would later sign documents declaring that all men are created equal built their fortunes on the systematic denial of equality to those whose labor supported their way of life. As sleep finally claims you in your comfortable bed, let your mind rest on this paradox that would shape American society for generations to come. The refined culture, sophisticated architecture, and intellectual achievements of colonial elite society represent genuine human accomplishments, but they were purchased at a terrible price in human suffering. Understanding this history requires us to acknowledge both the real cultural achievements of plantation society and the moral enormity of the system that made those achievements possible. The indentured servants whose stories we have followed through their daily labors, their failed rebellions, and their hidden attempts at dignity were not merely unfortunate individuals caught up in an unfortunate system. They were the human foundation upon which colonial America's prosperity was built, their unpaid labor, the source of the wealth that would eventually make possible the political and cultural developments that Americans celebrate as their founding achievements. In the morning, you will wake refreshed in your elegant guest chamber, and servants will appear to assist with your needs, their own exhaustion carefully hidden behind masks of willing service. The breakfast that greets you will be prepared by bound workers whose own morning meal consists of coarse fare, barely adequate for survival. The newspapers you read will be printed on paper manufactured with techniques developed by free craftsmen, but implemented by unfree labor, filled with discussions of political philosophy written by men whose leisure to think and write has been purchased with others' bondage. This is the world that indentured servants built and sustained, a world of remarkable achievement and systematic brutality, of genuine refinement and profound moral blindness. Their stories remind us that American prosperity has always rested on the labor of people who were excluded from sharing fairly in the fruits of their work, that the freedoms Americans celebrate were often purchased at the cost of others' liberty, and that understanding our history requires acknowledging both its achievements and its victims. Here, in this jewel of the medieval world, rose palaces of such magnificence that visitors from distant lands would weep at their beauty. Yet beneath the glittering surfaces of gold and marble, beneath the whispered prayers echoing through countless chapels, lay a world of intricate dangers and suffocating protocols that would challenge every fiber of your being. Tonight, we invite you to rest your weary mind as we explore this vanished world together. You need do nothing but listen, allowing the gentle current of these ancient stories to carry you toward peaceful sleep. We'll walk the marble corridors where emperors once trod, breathe the incense-heavy air of forgotten ceremonies, and witness the daily struggles of those who lived their entire lives in the shadow of absolute power. The Byzantine Empire, that 1,000-year continuation of Rome itself, created a court culture of unparalleled complexity and beauty. But as you'll discover in the comfort of these quiet moments, beauty often came at a terrible price, and luxury could become its own kind of prison. Let the weight of your day dissolve as we begin this journey, allowing yourself to sink deeper into comfort with each passing moment as we explore what life was truly like for those who dwelt within the golden walls of the most powerful palace on earth. Picture yourself awakening not to the gentle freedom of choosing your own morning routine, but to the relentless chiming of bells that divide your day into segments as rigid as iron chains. In the great palace of Constantinople, every moment of your existence would be governed by protocols so intricate, so unforgiving, that a single misstep could cost you everything you held dear. Imagine the weight settling on your shoulders as you realize that you are now part of a world where your very survival depends on mastering an elaborate dance of submission, where the wrong gesture, the improper degree of bow, or a moment's hesitation in the presence of imperial majesty could spell your doom. Your day would begin before dawn, as it did for every soul within the palace walls, with the understanding that your body no longer belonged entirely to you. Feel the cold marble beneath your knees as you assume the position that would become as familiar as breathing, the proskinesis, the full prostration required in the presence of your emperor. But this was no simple bow. Imagine yourself lowering your entire body to the floor, pressing your forehead against stone that has been worn smooth by countless others who perform this same ritual of absolute submission. Your arms must be positioned precisely, your breathing controlled, your very heartbeat steady, for the emperor's attention was said to be so keen that he could detect the slightest tremor of fear or insincerity. The protocol demanded not just one prostration, but a carefully choreographed series of them, each with its own subtle variations depending on your rank, the day of the week, the season, and the emperor's mood. Court officials spent decades memorizing these variations, their lives depending on the precision of their genuflections. Consider the physical toll this would exact upon your body. Day after day, year after year, your knees would bear the weight of this ritualized submission. Courtiers developed permanent calluses, their joints aching in the dampness that perpetually clung to the palace corridors. Yet to show discomfort, to shift your weight or adjust your position without permission would be interpreted as a sign of disrespect that could result in immediate banishment, or worse. The language of survival. Within these walls, you would quickly learn that ordinary human speech was a luxury you could no longer afford. Every word that passed your lips would need to be filtered through layers of protocol so complex that seasoned diplomats employed entire staffs simply to compose the appropriate form of address for different occasions. Imagine the constant mental exhaustion of never being able to speak naturally, of having to translate every thought through the labyrinthine requirements of court etiquette before allowing it to reach your tongue. A simple request for water became an elaborate ritual of self-deprecation and imperial praise. To ask for food required acknowledging your unworthiness to consume anything that had been blessed by the emperor's presence. The titles alone formed a bewildering hierarchy that you would be expected to memorize perfectly. The Kuropalats ranked above the magistros, who in turn held precedence over the patrician, but all paled before the Kaiser, and heaven helped the soul who confused the proper form of address for a protospatharios with that of a spatharocandidatos. Each title carried its own specific vocabulary, its own required gestures, its own unforgivable taboos. Even silence became a carefully calculated political act. To remain quiet when speech was expected could be interpreted as sullen resistance to imperial authority. Yet to speak when silence was required demonstrated a dangerous lack of self-control. Courtiers developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the subtle cues that indicated when words were welcome and when they should melt into the background like shadows. The poison fear. Perhaps most terrifying of all was the knowledge that death could come not from the glittering blade of an executioner, but from something as innocent as your morning meal. The Byzantine court existed in a perpetual state of paranoia about poison, and with good reason. It was the preferred method of removing political obstacles in a world where open violence was considered beneath imperial dignity. Imagine never again being able to enjoy the simple pleasure of eating without first scanning the faces of those around you, searching for the telltale signs of someone who knows something you do not. Every cup of wine became a potential death sentence, every morsel of bread a gamble with eternity. The emperor employed teams of food tasters, but even they could not provide complete security. Clever assassins developed poisons that acted slowly, allowing the taster to sample the food safely, while ensuring the intended victim would succumb hours or days later. Others created compounds that only became lethal when combined with specific foods consumed in a particular sequence over several meals. Your sleep would be haunted by stories whispered in the corridors, tales of courtiers who retired healthy and were found dead by morning, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies showing no external wounds. The poison makers of Constantinople were said to possess arts so subtle that they could craft a substance that mimicked the symptoms of natural illness, leaving no trace for even the most skilled physician to detect. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was perhaps worse than the physical danger. Imagine the corrosive effect on your soul of viewing every act of kindness with suspicion, of analyzing every gesture for hidden threats, of living in a world where trust became the most dangerous luxury of all, the terror of imperial displeasure. But even more frightening than poison was the possibility of earning the emperor's direct attention for unwelcome reasons. In the Byzantine system, the ruler was not merely a political leader, but a sacred figure, the earthly representative of divine authority. To displease him was not simply to commit a social error or political mistake. It was to sin against the cosmic order itself. Picture the suffocating dread that would settle over your chest when word reached you that the emperor had inquired about some aspect of your conduct, some decision you had made, some report that had reached his ears. In that moment, your life would hang by a thread so fine that the slightest breath could sever it entirely. The emperor's displeasure could manifest in ways both subtle and brutal. Some courtiers simply vanished, their rooms empty one morning, their names erased from official documents as if they had never existed. Others found themselves assigned to impossible tasks in distant provinces, sent to govern regions plagued by barbarian raids or natural disasters, their failure predetermined by the very nature of their assignments. The lucky ones faced only social death, the slow strangulation of being systematically excluded from court functions, watching as former colleagues avoided their gaze and conversations died when they approached. To be cut off from the intricate web of palace relationships was to become a ghost among the living, still breathing but no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense. The labyrinth of ceremonial obligations. Your days would be consumed by an endless succession of ceremonies, each more elaborate than the last, each demanding perfect execution under the weight of ancient tradition and imperial expectations. The Byzantine court had inherited the Roman love of spectacle and amplified it through centuries of Christian mysticism and Eastern influence, creating rituals of such complexity that they required their own specialized literature to document properly. Imagine the mental strain of memorizing not just your role in these ceremonies, but the intricate timing that governed every movement, every gesture, every moment of participation. The morning reception alone could last for hours, as hundreds of courtiers filed through the throne room in strict order of precedence, each performing their designated role in a dance that had been choreographed over centuries. There were ceremonies for the changing of the seasons, ceremonies to mark religious holidays, ceremonies to celebrate military victories, and ceremonies to mourn defeats. Special ceremonies marked the emperor's birthday, his accession day, and the anniversary of every significant event in imperial history. Each required different costumes, different levels of prostration, different formulaic phrases, and different degrees of participation based on your exact position in the court hierarchy. The clothing alone would become a burden that defined your existence. The heavy silk robes, weighted down with gold thread and precious stones, made simple movement an act of careful calculation. The elaborate headdresses and ceremonial ornaments required servants to dress and undress you, making even the most basic human activities dependent on the cooperation of others who might have their own reasons for ensuring your discomfort or failure. Privacy, that most basic of human needs, would become nothing more than a distant memory from your former life. Every corridor in the Great Palace echoed with footsteps that might belong to informants. Every conversation took place under the assumption that unfriendly ears were listening. Every facial expression was subject to interpretation by those whose survival might depend on their ability to provide interesting information to their superiors. The emperor maintained an extensive network of spies and informants, drawn from every level of palace society. Servants reported on their masters, clerks monitored their supervisors, and even high-ranking officials kept careful watch on their peers. The most trusted advisors often proved to be the most dangerous, as their privileged access to sensitive information made their reports especially valuable to the imperial intelligence apparatus. Imagine the exhaustion of never being able to relax your guard, of monitoring every word and gesture, not just for their immediate appropriateness, but for how they might be interpreted by unknown observers and reported through chains of informants whose motivations and loyalties remained forever mysterious. The simplest human interactions became exercises in careful diplomatic calculation, with every smile measured and every frown potentially fatal. Letters were routinely intercepted and read, personal belongings searched for evidence of disloyalty or forbidden activities, and even private religious observances monitored for signs of heretical thinking. The concept of personal space existed only as a fondly remembered dream from life outside the palace walls, where ordinary people could close a door and be truly alone with their thoughts. The psychological imprisonment. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of palace life was the way it gradually hollowed out your sense of authentic self, replacing your natural reactions and genuine emotions with carefully crafted performances designed to ensure survival. Over time, courtiers often found that they could no longer distinguish between their true feelings and the elaborate masks they wore in public, their personalities fragmenting under the constant pressure to be someone other than who they really were. The isolation was profound, even in the midst of hundreds of other people. True friendship became impossible when every companion might be a potential informant, and romantic relationships were filtered through political calculations that reduced love to a strategic commodity. Children grew up in this environment, learning to smile while planning betrayal, to speak words of affection while harboring thoughts of revenge. Imagine the gradual erosion of your ability to trust your own instincts, as the natural human responses that had guided you through life outside the palace proved not just useless, but actively dangerous in this rarefied atmosphere of perpetual performance. The simple pleasure of expressing an honest opinion became a luxury you could no longer afford, replaced by the exhausting mental exercise of calculating what others wanted to hear and how to phrase it in the most politically advantageous manner. The nights offered no respite from these pressures. Sleep became light and restless, haunted by anxieties about the next day's obligations and the countless ways that even the most careful plans could go wrong. Dreams themselves became dangerous, as it was rumored that the emperor employed specialists who claimed to interpret the dream life of courtiers for signs of hidden disloyalty or dangerous ambitions. As we let these images of suffocating protocol and constant danger fade gently from our minds, we can appreciate the simple freedom of our own peaceful moments, the luxury of expressing our true thoughts, the comfort of genuine privacy. Rest easy, knowing that no emperor watches your dreams, no courtiers measure your breathing, no informants catalogue your sighs. Let yourself sink deeper into the soft embrace of true relaxation, grateful for the absence of golden chains, thankful for the blessing of authentic sleep, as we prepare to explore another chapter in this vanished world of beautiful terror and terrible beauty. As the echoes of court protocol fade into the gentle rhythm of your breathing, let us turn our attention to one remarkable woman whose life embodied both the possibilities and perils of the Byzantine world. Picture yourself settling more comfortably as we explore the extraordinary story of Theodora, a woman whose journey from the lowest depths of society to the highest pinnacle of power reveals the complex currents that flowed beneath the golden surface of imperial Constantinople. Imagine a world where birth determined destiny with iron certainty, where the daughter of a bear keeper could never dream of speaking to nobility, let alone ruling an empire. Yet, in the swirling complexities of Byzantine society, where fortune could shift as quickly as the winds over the Bosphorus, even the most impossible transformations could unfold like petals opening to unexpected sunlight. Let your mind drift back to the great hippodrome of Constantinople, that massive arena where 100,000 voices could rise in unison, where the thunder of racing horses mingled with the roar of exotic beasts imported from the furthest reaches of the known world. Here, in this cathedral of entertainment and spectacle, our story begins with the scent of sawdust and the distant echo of wild applause. Theodora's father, Acacius, tended the bears that performed between the main events, creatures trained to dance and wrestle for the amusement of the crowds. Picture the young girl moving through this world of performers and entertainers, her small hands perhaps helping to feed the great lumbering animals, her ears filled with the constant noise of preparation and performance that marked the rhythm of hippodrome life. When Acacius died, the family's precarious position became desperate. Theodora's mother, faced with 3 young daughters and no means of support, did what countless women in her position had done throughout history. She sought the protection of a new man who might provide for them. But the politics of the hippodrome were as complex as those of the palace, and the family's fortunes became entangled with the bitter rivalry between the racing factions that dominated Constantinople's popular culture. Imagine the uncertainty that must have colored young Theodora's world as she watched her mother navigate the treacherous currents of patronage and favor that determined whether they would eat or starve. The hippodrome was not merely a place of entertainment, but a political arena where the common people expressed their loyalties and grievances, where emperors could gauge the mood of their subjects by listening to the chants that echoed from the great stone tiers. As Theodora grew into young womanhood, she entered the profession that seemed to offer the only path forward for a woman of her station and circumstances: the theatre. But to be an actress in 6th century Byzantium was to occupy a position that existed at the very margins of respectable society, a realm where talent and beauty could bring wealth and attention, but always at the cost of social respectability and moral standing. Picture the dimly lit chambers where Theodora would have prepared for her performances, the air thick with the scent of cosmetics and perfumes, the chatter of other women similarly situated on the edges of society. These were not the grand theatres of classical antiquity, but smaller, more intimate venues where the line between performer and courtesan often blurred beyond recognition. The audiences that gathered for these performances represented a cross-section of Constantinople's complex society. Merchants flush with profit from the silk trade, young aristocrats seeking entertainment away from the watchful eyes of their families, foreign visitors eager to sample the pleasures that the great city offered to those with sufficient coin. For a young woman possessed of intelligence and ambition, such venues provided opportunities to study the powerful men who would later shape her destiny. Imagine Theodora learning not just the arts of performance and seduction, but the far more valuable skills of reading human nature, understanding the desires and weaknesses that drove men to power, and recognizing the subtle currents of political ambition that flowed beneath the surface of even casual conversation. Every interaction became a lesson in the complex psychology of influence and manipulation. The historian Procopius, whose later writings would paint Theodora in the darkest possible colors, claimed that she performed acts on stage that scandalized even the jaded audiences of Constantinople. Whether his accounts reflect historical truth or the bitter prejudice of a man who despised her rise to power, they reveal the profound social distance that separated the world of the theater from the rarefied atmosphere of imperial legitimacy. Seeking to escape the limitations of her circumstances in Constantinople, Theodora embarked on a journey that would take her to the distant shores of North Africa, accompanying a Syrian official named Hesebelus, who had been appointed to a governorship in the Pentapolis region. Picture her boarding a ship in the golden harbor of Constantinople, perhaps feeling that she was leaving her past behind forever, unaware that this journey would ultimately lead her back to a destiny beyond her wildest imagination. The North African provinces of the Byzantine Empire were a world away from the sophistication of the capital, regions where Roman civilization maintained a tenuous hold against the encroaching desert and the constant threat of tribal raids. Here, in cities like Cyrenaica and Apollonia, Theodora encountered a different face of imperial power, harsher, more direct, less cushioned by the elaborate ceremonials that disguised the underlying realities of domination and submission. But the relationship with Hysebulus proved to be another disappointment in a life already marked by precarious dependencies on male protection and favor. When their arrangement ended badly, Theodora found herself stranded in Alexandria, that great center of learning and commerce that had been the jewel of the Ptolemaic kings and remained one of the most important cities in the Mediterranean world. Imagine her walking the streets of Alexandria, past the great lighthouse that guided ships from across the known world, through markets where the spices of India mingled with the grain of Egypt, and the manufactured goods of Byzantine workshops. Here, according to later accounts, she encountered the religious currents that were reshaping the spiritual landscape of the empire, particularly the monophysite Christianity that challenged the official theological positions established by the emperors in Constantinople. This exposure to alternative forms of Christianity would later prove crucial to Theodora's political influence, as she became a patron and protector of monophysite leaders during her years as empress. But for now, she was simply a woman far from home, dependent on her wits and determination to survive in a world that offered few opportunities for someone of her background and gender. The journey back to Constantinople was itself a transformation, as Theodora gradually shed the persona of the desperate actress seeking patrons and protection, replacing it with something far more sophisticated: the calculated presentation of a woman who understood power and knew how to use the weapons that society had allowed her to develop. Picture her moving through the social networks of the capital with new confidence, no longer the supplicant, but the strategic actor. It was during this period that she encountered Justinian, the nephew of Emperor Justin and heir apparent to the throne. The meeting was no accident of fate, but the result of careful calculation on both sides. Justinian recognizing in Theodora qualities that might prove useful to his imperial ambitions, while Theodora saw in the future emperor the ultimate patron, who could elevate her beyond the reach of those who would use her origins to destroy her. Imagine the delicate dance of courtship between these two ambitious souls, each bringing their own strengths to a partnership that would ultimately reshape the Byzantine Empire. Justinian offered legitimacy, power, and the protection of imperial authority. Theodora brought political intelligence, an understanding of the common people that aristocrats rarely possessed, and a ruthless determination to seize and hold power that matched his own imperial dreams. Their relationship scandalized Constantinople society, not merely because of Theodora's background as an actress, but because it represented a fundamental challenge to the social hierarchies that maintained the established order. Here was a future emperor choosing to share power with a woman whose very existence reminded the aristocracy that their privileged positions were not guaranteed by divine right, but maintained through human arrangements that could be altered by sufficiently determined opposition. The legal obstacles to their marriage seemed insurmountable, as Roman law specifically prohibited senators from marrying actresses. But Justinian's uncle, Emperor Justin, proved willing to change the law itself rather than see his heir's political plans frustrated by ancient prejudices. Picture the debates that must have raged in the palace corridors as traditionalists argued against this unprecedented breach of social custom, while pragmatists recognized that Theodora's influence over Justinian was already too strong to be broken by legal technicalities. When Justinian ascended to the throne in 527, Theodora was crowned alongside him as Augusta, not merely as an imperial consort, but as a true partner in power. The coronation ceremony itself represented a moment of profound historical significance, as this former actress knelt before the altar of Hagia Sophia to receive the crown that made her the equal of any empress in Byzantine history. Picture the weight of that golden crown settling on her head, not just the physical burden of precious metal and gems, but the symbolic transformation from social outcast to sacred ruler. In that moment, Theodora became living proof that the rigid hierarchies of Byzantine society were not as immutable as they appeared, that intelligence and determination could overcome even the most fundamental barriers of birth and social position. The early years of their joint reign were marked by ambitious projects that reflected both rulers' determination to leave their mark on history. The great legal code that bears Justinian's name, the architectural marvel of the new Hagia Sophia, and the military campaigns that briefly restored Byzantine control over much of the former Western Roman Empire. All of these achievements reflected the partnership between emperor and empress, each bringing their unique perspectives and capabilities to the challenges of imperial leadership. But Theodora's influence extended far beyond the grand public gestures that historians typically record. She maintained her own court, received her own embassies, and pursued her own political agenda with the same ruthless efficiency that had carried her from the bearkeeper's daughter to the throne of the Roman Empire. Foreign ambassadors quickly learned that securing Theodora's support was often more important than winning the emperor's approval, as her opposition could doom even the most carefully negotiated treaties. The greatest test of Theodora's courage and political skill came in January 532, when the simmering tensions of Constantinople erupted into the most serious domestic crisis of Justinian's reign. The Nika riots, named for the victory chant that became the rebels' battle cry, began as a dispute over chariot racing, but quickly evolved into a full-scale rebellion that threatened to overthrow the imperial government and install a new dynasty. Picture the city consumed by flames as angry crowds surged through the streets, burning public buildings and attacking symbols of imperial authority. For 5 days, Constantinople teetered on the edge of anarchy as the blue and green racing factions, traditional rivals who rarely agreed on anything, united in their opposition to Justinian's heavy taxation and authoritarian policies. The emperor, faced with a rebellion that had already claimed thousands of lives and showed no signs of abating, began to consider the unthinkable, abandoning the capital and fleeing to a safer location where he might gather forces to retake his throne. It was a moment when the weight of imperial responsibility seemed too heavy to bear, when the golden palace that had seemed so secure revealed itself to be little more than an elaborate trap for its occupants. But Theodora, drawing on reserves of courage and determination that surprised even those who knew her best, refused to countenance retreat. In words that have echoed through history, she declared that purple makes a fine winding sheet, that she would rather die as an empress than live as an exile. Picture her standing before the assembled council, this former actress now commanding generals and senators with an authority that brooked no argument. Her speech, as recorded by the court historian Procopius, revealed not just personal courage, but shrewd political calculation. Theodora understood that flight would mean the permanent loss of imperial authority, that an emperor who abandoned his capital in the face of popular uprising could never again claim the divine sanction that legitimized Byzantine rule. Better to face death with dignity than to live with the shame of cowardice. The decision to stand and fight led to one of the bloodiest episodes in Constantinople's history, as imperial forces under the command of Belisarius and Mundus trapped thousands of rebels in the Hippodrome and slaughtered them without mercy. Picture the great arena, which had been Theodora's childhood home, now running red with the blood of those who had challenged imperial authority. The suppression of the Nika riots marked a turning point in both Theodora's personal development and the broader character of Justinian's reign. The woman who had once performed for the entertainment of Constantinople's crowds now commanded the forces that could drown rebellion in blood, demonstrating that her rise to power had brought not just personal transformation, but a fundamental hardening of her political will. In the aftermath of the riots, Theodora's influence over imperial policy became even more pronounced. She had proven herself capable of making the hard decisions that effective rule required, and Justinian increasingly relied on her counsel in matters both domestic and foreign. The partnership that had begun as a marriage of convenience and mutual advantage had evolved into something deeper, a genuine sharing of power between two individuals who understood that their survival depended on their ability to present a united front against all challenges. The reconstruction of Constantinople after the riots provided opportunities for Theodora to demonstrate her vision of imperial magnificence. As new buildings rose from the ashes of the old with architectural innovations that reflected both rulers' determination to create a capital worthy of their enlarged ambitions. The new Hagia Sophia, completed just 5 years after the riots, stood as a testament to the resilience of imperial power and the creative potential that could emerge from even the most destructive crises. One of the most fascinating aspects of Theodora's reign was her deep involvement in the religious controversies that divided the Byzantine Empire, particularly her support for monophysite Christianity against the orthodox positions favored by most of the imperial establishment. This was not merely a matter of personal piety, but a sophisticated political strategy that recognized the importance of maintaining unity across the empire's diverse religious communities. Picture Theodora holding secret meetings with monophysite leaders in the palace, providing them with protection and financial support, even as her husband's official policies seemed to oppose their theological positions. This careful balancing act required extraordinary political skill, as she had to maintain the appearance of religious orthodoxy while actually working to protect those whom many considered heretics. Her involvement in theological disputes reflected a broader understanding of imperial power that went beyond the traditional focus on military conquest and administrative efficiency. Theodora recognized that effective rule required the active management of religious diversity, that an empire stretching from Spain to Mesopotamia could not be held together by force alone, but needed the willing cooperation of its various communities and traditions. The empress established networks of communication and support that extended far beyond the boundaries of the capital, maintaining correspondence with religious leaders in Egypt, Syria, and other regions where monophysite beliefs remained strong. Picture the careful coded language of these letters, the delicate negotiations required to balance competing theological claims while maintaining imperial unity. As Theodora aged into the full maturity of her imperial authority, she became increasingly focused on securing her political legacy and ensuring that the changes she had helped bring about would survive her own death. The Empress understood that her extraordinary rise to power had created enemies who would not hesitate to undo her achievements if given the opportunity, and she worked tirelessly to create institutional safeguards that would protect her interests and those of her supporters. Picture her in her final years, no longer the stunning beauty who had captivated Constantinople's audiences, but a formidable political figure whose word could determine the fate of kingdoms. The transformation was complete. The bearkeeper's daughter had become one of the most powerful women in history, proving that determination and intelligence could overcome even the most seemingly insurmountable obstacles. When Theodora died in 548, struck down by what contemporary sources describe as cancer, she left behind an empire that had been fundamentally changed by her influence. Justinian, bereft of his partner and closest advisor, would rule for another 17 years, but never again with the same confident authority that had marked their joint reign during its most successful period. The historical assessments of Theodora's life and reign reflect the complex attitudes that her extraordinary rise provoked among contemporaries and later observers. Some saw her as a dangerous upstart whose elevation violated the natural order of society, while others recognized in her story a testament to the possibilities that Byzantine civilization offered to those with sufficient courage and skill to seize them. As we allow these images of imperial transformation to fade gently into the peaceful rhythm of our breathing, we can marvel at the human capacity for reinvention and growth. Let yourself rest in the comfort of knowing that even in the most rigid societies, individual determination could sometimes reshape the very foundations of power. And as the story of Theodora's remarkable ascension settles into the quiet corners of your mind, let us turn our attention to the enigmas that still puzzle historians and archaeologists today. Picture yourself drifting deeper into comfort as we explore the shadowy realm of Byzantine secrets, where ancient knowledge disappeared into the mists of time, leaving only tantalizing fragments and unanswered questions. In this gentle exploration of mystery and discovery, you need only listen and wonder, allowing your breathing to slow naturally as we delve into the lost arts and vanished splendors that once made Constantinople the wonder of the medieval world. Here, in the soft embrace of historical curiosity, we find questions more intriguing than any answers, puzzles that continue to whisper their secrets across the centuries. Imagine yourself standing on the walls of Constantinople as enemy ships approach across the dark waters of the Bosphorus, their sails billowing with confidence, their crews preparing for what they believe will be a straightforward naval assault. But then, as if summoned by imperial command, jets of liquid fire burst forth from the Byzantine vessels, turning the sea itself into a cauldron of destruction that no amount of water could extinguish. This was Greek fire, the most closely guarded military secret of the Byzantine Empire, a weapon so devastating and mysterious that its very existence seemed to violate the natural order of the elements. For over 6 centuries, this incendiary compound gave the Byzantines a crucial advantage over their enemies, transforming naval warfare and helping to preserve the empire through countless sieges and invasions. Picture the terror in the eyes of Arab raiders as their wooden ships became floating infernos, the flames spreading across the water like liquid lightning, immune to every attempt to douse them with seawater or sand. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the physical destruction, as enemy commanders learned to fear the very sight of Byzantine naval vessels, knowing that they carried within their hulls the power to turn the ocean into an instrument of annihilation. The formula for Greek fire was known to only a handful of individuals at any given time, passed down through generations of military engineers who guarded the secret as jealously as any religious relic. The knowledge was compartmentalized so thoroughly that even the emperor himself might not know the complete recipe, ensuring that no single betrayal could compromise this crucial advantage. Contemporary accounts describe the substance as a thick, viscous liquid that ignited upon contact with water, burning with such intensity that it could melt metal and consume entire fleets within minutes. The delivery systems were equally ingenious. Bronze tubes called siphons that could project the burning mixture over considerable distances, turning Byzantine ships into floating artillery platforms that dominated the medieval seas. Let your mind wander into the hidden workshops beneath the Great Palace, where imperial alchemists labored in chambers filled with the acrid smoke of experimental fires and the sharp scent of exotic chemicals imported from the furthest reaches of the known world. These were not the romantic laboratories of later legend, but practical facilities where the survival of an empire depended on the mastery of processes that seemed to border on magic. Picture the rows of clay vessels and bronze instruments, the carefully controlled furnaces where temperatures were maintained with precision that modern chemists would admire, the meticulous records kept in coded script that only the initiated could decipher. Here, in these underground chambers, Byzantine scientists pushed the boundaries of contemporary knowledge, developing not only military applications, but also the industrial processes that supported the empire's economic dominance. The creation of Greek fire required materials from across the empire and beyond. Sulfur from volcanic regions, petroleum products from deposits near the Black Sea, saltpeter from carefully managed caves, and exotic resins from trees that grew only in specific climates. The logistics of maintaining this supply chain represented a remarkable achievement in medieval administration, requiring diplomatic relationships, trade networks, and transportation systems that could deliver sensitive materials to the capital without alerting potential enemies to their intended use. The master craftsmen who oversaw these operations occupied a unique position in Byzantine society, treated with a combination of reverence and suspicion that reflected the dangerous knowledge they possessed. They lived lives of comfortable isolation, provided with everything they needed to continue their work, but carefully monitored to ensure their loyalty remained absolute. Their deaths were sometimes treated as state secrets, their burial places unmarked to prevent enemies from desecrating their remains in futile hopes of extracting the empire's most precious secrets. The tactical applications of Greek fire revolutionized medieval naval combat, transforming the Byzantine navy from a collection of traditional warships into a technological force that could dominate opponents regardless of numerical disadvantage. Picture the specialized vessels designed specifically to deploy this weapon. Ships with reinforced hulls to withstand the heat of their own armament, crews trained in the precise timing required to maximize the effectiveness of each discharge. The deployment of Greek fire required extraordinary coordination between the various specialists involved in its preparation and use. Engineers maintained the delivery systems, calculating wind patterns and sea conditions to ensure optimal range and accuracy. Chemical specialists prepared the mixture according to formulas that might vary based on weather conditions, target types, and strategic objectives. Naval commanders orchestrated complex maneuvers that brought their vessels close enough to enemy formations to ensure devastating impact while minimizing the risk of counterattack. Imagine the psychological preparation required for crews operating these weapons. Men who knew that a single mistake in handling could turn their own ship into the same kind of inferno they hoped to inflict on their enemies. The training regimens were exhaustive, incorporating not only technical skills, but also the mental discipline necessary to remain calm and focused while working with substances that could kill instantly if mishandled. The defensive applications were equally sophisticated, as Greek fire could be deployed from fixed installations along coastlines and harbor entrances, creating barriers of flame that made amphibious assaults virtually impossible. Picture the great chains that stretched across the Golden Horn, supplemented by fire-projecting stations that could turn the entire harbor into a death trap for any fleet foolish enough to attempt a direct assault on Constantinople. As the Byzantine Empire faced increasing pressures from multiple directions, the careful systems that had preserved the secrets of Greek fire began to deteriorate. The master craftsmen died without properly trained successors, their knowledge fragmenting among apprentices who understood only portions of the complete process. Political instability disrupted the supply chains that provided essential materials, forcing experimentation with substitute ingredients that produced inferior results. Picture the slow decay of institutional memory, as bureaucratic records were lost or destroyed during political upheavals, as libraries burned during enemy raids, as the oral traditions that supplemented written formulas were broken by the deaths of those who carried them. The empire that had once guarded its secrets so carefully now found itself losing them through simple neglect and the overwhelming pressures of continuous warfare. The final uses of authentic Greek fire appear to have occurred during the latter centuries of the empire, deployed against Ottoman forces who were already employing gunpowder weapons that made traditional incendiary compounds increasingly obsolete. By the time Constantinople fell in 1453, the secret that had protected the city for so many centuries had already vanished, taking with it one of the most remarkable technological achievements of the medieval world. Modern attempts to recreate Greek fire have produced substances with some of its described characteristics, but none that fully match the accounts left by contemporary witnesses. The complete formula remains one of history's greatest lost secrets, a reminder of how quickly human knowledge can disappear when the institutions that preserve it are disrupted by the chaotic forces of historical change. While the secrets of Greek fire vanished into written accounts and scholarly speculation, the Great Palace of Constantinople presents a different kind of mystery, one written in stone and buried earth, where archaeologists struggle to reconstruct the daily realities of imperial life from fragments and foundations that hint at vanished magnificence. Picture yourself walking across the modern neighborhoods of Istanbul, where apartment buildings and busy streets cover the remains of what was once the largest palace complex in the medieval world. Beneath your feet lie the buried remnants of architectural achievement that rivaled anything produced by human civilization. A vast network of halls and chambers that housed not just the imperial family, but an entire government apparatus, along with the countless servants, guards, and officials required to maintain the machinery of empire. The Great Palace was not a single building, but an entire district. A sprawling complex that evolved over centuries as successive emperors added new sections, renovated existing structures, and adapted the ancient foundations to meet changing needs and architectural fashions. The result was a labyrinthine wonderland of interconnected spaces that challenged even contemporary visitors to navigate successfully without experienced guides. What makes the palace such an archaeological puzzle is not just its enormous size, but the thorough way in which it was dismantled and recycled after the Ottoman conquest. The new rulers had their own architectural traditions and saw little value in preserving the physical symbols of Byzantine power. Marble columns were removed to grace new mosques, decorative elements were incorporated into Ottoman palaces, and entire sections were quarried for building materials to construct the new imperial capital. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries related to the Great Palace came in the 1930s, when construction workers uncovered what appeared to be a section of magnificent floor mosaics buried beneath centuries of accumulated debris. Picture the excitement of archaeologists as they carefully exposed panel after panel of intricate stonework, each square revealing new details about the artistic traditions and daily life of the vanished imperial court. The mosaics depicted scenes of extraordinary variety and sophistication, hunting expeditions featuring exotic animals from across the empire, children at play with toys and games that provided insights into Byzantine childhood, pastoral landscapes that revealed contemporary attitudes toward nature and rural life. The technical quality of the work demonstrated levels of artistic achievement that challenged assumptions about medieval craftsmanship, while the subject matter provided unprecedented glimpses into the private world of imperial leisure and entertainment. But these discoveries also raised as many questions as they answered. The location of the mosaics within the palace complex remained unclear, as did their date of creation and the specific purposes of the rooms they once adorned. Were these public spaces where the emperor received guests, or private chambers reserved for family use? Did they represent the artistic tastes of a particular ruler, or were they accumulated over generations of imperial occupation? The preservation of these mosaics was itself a mystery, as the careful way they had been covered suggested deliberate protection rather than accidental burial. Some scholars theorized that palace officials had tried to preserve particularly valuable decorations during periods of political instability, while others suggested that the covering represented attempts to update architectural styles without destroying older work that might have held sentimental or historical value. Contemporary accounts of the Great Palace frequently mention sophisticated water systems that provided not only basic utilities, but also elaborate decorative features that amazed visitors from across the known world. Picture fountains that could be programmed to create different patterns and heights, artificial streams that meandered through garden courtyards, and cooling systems that made the hottest summer days comfortable within the palace walls. Archaeological investigations have uncovered portions of these water systems, revealing engineering achievements that demonstrate remarkable understanding of hydraulic principles and mechanical engineering. The pipes and conduits show evidence of precise calculation in their design, with gradients and flow rates calibrated to serve multiple functions simultaneously, providing drinking water, powering mechanical devices, and creating the atmospheric effects that enhance the palace's reputation for magical magnificence. But the complete scope of these systems remains unknown, as most of the infrastructure was built into foundations and walls that have since been destroyed or remain inaccessible beneath modern development. The scattered fragments that archaeologists have recovered suggest a level of technological sophistication that challenges conventional assumptions about medieval engineering capabilities, but they provide only glimpses of what must have been integrated systems of remarkable complexity and ambition. The maintenance of these water systems would have required specialized knowledge and constant attention, representing another aspect of palace life that disappeared along with the physical structures. The craftsmen who understood how to repair and modify these installations took their expertise to their graves, leaving behind only the mute testimony of corroded pipes and filled channels that speak of vanished technical mastery. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Great Palace was the presence of workshops and manufacturing facilities that produced the luxury goods associated with imperial power and prestige. These were not crude medieval craft operations, but sophisticated production centers that combined artistic excellence with technological innovation, creating objects that served both practical and ceremonial functions within the complex machinery of imperial representation. Picture the silk workshops where imperial garments were woven with threads of gold and silver, where colors were created using dyes imported from India and techniques guarded as carefully as military secrets. The quality of Byzantine silk became legendary throughout the medieval world, but the specific processes used to achieve such remarkable results remain largely mysterious, as the craftsmen who possessed this knowledge formed closed guilds that transmitted their expertise only to carefully chosen successors. The metalworking facilities produced everything from everyday utensils to elaborate ceremonial objects, demonstrating mastery of techniques that modern craftsmen struggle to replicate. Archaeological discoveries have revealed evidence of sophisticated furnaces capable of achieving temperatures and atmospheric conditions required for advanced metallurgy, but the specific methods used to operate these installations have been lost, along with the communities of specialists who once maintained them. Perhaps most mysteriously, some accounts suggest the existence of workshops dedicated to creating mechanical devices and automated figures that could perform lifelike movements during imperial ceremonies. While such descriptions might represent literary exaggeration, archaeological evidence does support the existence of complex gear systems and mechanical devices that suggest at least some basis in historical reality for these seemingly fantastic claims. The garden spaces of the Great Palace represented another dimension of imperial luxury that has proven particularly challenging for archaeologists to reconstruct. Unlike buildings which leave foundation traces and structural remains, gardens exist primarily as organic systems that decay and disappear with remarkable thoroughness when no longer maintained. Contemporary descriptions speak of garden courtyards that recreated landscapes from across the empire, where plants from Egypt grew alongside specimens from the Black Sea region, and architectural elements created microclimates that allowed Mediterranean and continental species to flourish side by side. Picture the careful planning required to create such environments, the constant attention needed to maintain them, and the network of specialists required to supply seeds, cuttings, and mature plants from distant provinces. Archaeological investigation has revealed traces of elaborate drainage systems and soil preparation that support these accounts. But the actual plant communities that once filled these spaces can only be inferred from pollen analysis, and occasional plant remains preserved in favorable conditions. The result is a reconstruction process that combines hard archaeological evidence with educated speculation based on contemporary gardening practices and environmental conditions. The psychological impact of these gardens on palace inhabitants and visitors can only be imagined, but their importance to imperial culture is suggested by the resources devoted to their creation and maintenance. They represented not just aesthetic achievements, but demonstrations of imperial power over the natural world, showing that the emperor could command resources and expertise sufficient to recreate any environment within his own domain. As archaeological work in Istanbul continues, new discoveries occasionally add fragments to our understanding of the Great Palace, but each revelation seems to emphasize how much remains unknown about this vanished wonder of the medieval world. The scale of what has been lost becomes clearer with each excavation, as does the realization that much of the palace's original extent now lies beneath modern development that makes comprehensive investigation impossible. Picture the countless rooms and chambers that once housed the daily operations of empire, now reduced to scattered foundations and fragmentary floor plans that archaeologists piece together like an enormous puzzle with most of its pieces missing. The human stories that once filled these spaces, the conversations that shaped imperial policy, the ceremonies that reinforced political loyalty, the quiet moments of family life that humanized the abstract machinery of power, have vanished as completely as the buildings that sheltered them. Yet in this very incompleteness lies a different kind of wonder, as our imagination is invited to fill the spaces that archaeology cannot completely recover. The mystery of the Great Palace becomes not just a scholarly puzzle, but an invitation to contemplation, a reminder that even the most magnificent human achievements ultimately return to the earth from which they arose, leaving only traces and memories to mark their passage through time. Let these images of vanished magnificence and lost knowledge settle gently into the peaceful rhythm of your breathing, as we prepare to explore one final aspect of this remarkable civilization. Rest easy, knowing that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, that the gaps in our knowledge create spaces where wonder can flourish, where the imagination can wander freely through the gardens of possibility that no archaeologist's spade will ever completely uncover. As the mysteries of Greek fire and vanished palaces fade into the gentle currents of historical contemplation, let us turn our attention to the spectacular world of Byzantine court life at its most magnificent. Picture yourself settling into deeper comfort as we explore the elaborate ceremonies and sumptuous entertainments that transformed the Great Palace into a stage for displays of wealth and power that dazzled visitors from across the known world. Here, in these final moments of our journey through Imperial Constantinople, you need only breathe slowly and listen, allowing yourself to drift among images of silk and gold, of mechanical marvels and orchestrated splendor, as we discover how the Byzantine elite created a theater of power that made their court the envy of medieval civilization. Imagine yourself approaching the Chrysotriklinos, the golden dining hall that served as the centerpiece of imperial entertainment. your footsteps echoing softly against marble floors that reflected light from countless oil lamps like a constellation brought down from heaven. The very air would seem to shimmer with luxury, thick with the scent of exotic incense and the whispered conversations of the most powerful people in the medieval world. The hall itself was designed not merely as a dining space, but as a carefully orchestrated environment for the display of imperial majesty. Picture walls covered in mosaics that depicted the emperor in various divine contexts, receiving authority from Christ himself, being crowned by angels, or presiding over allegorical representations of the provinces that acknowledged his supremacy. Every surface proclaimed the sacred nature of imperial power, creating an atmosphere where even the most jaded aristocrat might feel themselves in the presence of something approaching the divine. The ceiling soared overhead, in a complex arrangement of domes and vaults, each surface decorated with stars of gold against backgrounds of the deepest blue, creating the impression that diners were feasting not merely in a palace, but in a representation of the heavenly court itself. Contemporary accounts describe mechanical devices hidden within the architectural elements, systems of pulleys and counterweights that could make stars move across the artificial sky, creating the illusion that the very cosmos participated in imperial celebrations. The lighting alone represented a marvel of medieval engineering, as hundreds of oil lamps were arranged in patterns that could be adjusted throughout the evening to create different moods and atmospheric effects. Picture the subtle changes in illumination that marked the progression from one course to the next, the way shadows and highlights could be manipulated to focus attention on particular speakers or to emphasize the ceremonial presentation of especially magnificent dishes. The acoustics of the space were equally carefully calculated, designed to carry the emperor's voice to every corner, while dampening the conversations of individual diners to create an atmosphere of respectful attention. Musicians positioned in hidden galleries could provide accompaniment that seemed to emerge from the very walls, while the careful placement of curtains and tapestries ensured that every word spoken from the imperial throne reached its intended audience with perfect clarity. Before entering the dining hall, guests would pass through the great throne room, where they encountered one of the most famous examples of Byzantine theatrical engineering, the mechanical throne that could rise toward the ceiling while mechanical lions roared and golden birds sang in artificial trees. Picture the carefully orchestrated sequence of marvels that greeted foreign ambassadors, each effect timed to maximize psychological impact and demonstrate the empire's mastery over both nature and technology. The throne itself was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, constructed with hidden mechanisms that could elevate the emperor high above his subjects while maintaining perfect stability and comfort. Contemporary accounts describe the smooth, silent operation of these devices, suggesting a level of mechanical sophistication that challenged the technological capabilities of any medieval civilization. The psychological effect was precisely calculated. As the throne rose, visitors were forced to crane their necks upward, placing them in the physical position of supplicants, while the emperor literally looked down upon them from an ever-increasing height. But the throne was only the centerpiece of a larger mechanical theater that included moving birds crafted from gold and precious stones, their songs produced by ingenious wind mechanisms that could create melodies complex enough to fool listeners into believing they heard living creatures. Picture the artificial trees that house these mechanical wonders. Their leaves crafted from silk in shades of green so subtle that only the most careful observation revealed their artificial nature. The lions that flanked the throne were perhaps the most psychologically effective elements of this mechanical display. Their roars produced by wind chambers that could create sounds ranging from low growls to thunderous proclamations of imperial power. The timing of these effects was crucial. Ambassadors would be announced to the sound of gentle birdsong, but any sign of disrespect or inappropriate behavior would trigger the lion's roars, creating an atmosphere of barely controlled danger that reminded everyone present of the consequences of challenging imperial authority. The operation of these mechanical marvels required teams of skilled technicians working in chambers beneath the throne room, their movements coordinated with the precision of a military operation. Picture these unseen operators following scripts that had been refined through generations of imperial ceremonies, their timing so perfect that the mechanical effects seemed to respond spontaneously to the emperor's will and mood. The imperial banquet itself was less a meal than a carefully choreographed ceremony that could last for many hours, each course presented with theatrical flourishes designed to demonstrate the empire's wealth and the emperor's generosity. Picture yourself reclining on silk cushions as servants moved through the hall with the measured pace of dancers, their every gesture predetermined by protocols that had been refined through centuries of imperial entertainment. The sequence of courses followed patterns that reflected both practical considerations and symbolic meanings, beginning with delicate appetizers that prepared the palate while allowing guests to admire the magnificent setting and progressing through increasingly elaborate presentations that showcased ingredients and preparation techniques from across the empire and beyond. Each dish told a story about imperial power, whether through the exotic nature of its ingredients, the complexity of its preparation, or the artistry of its presentation. Picture servants entering in synchronized processions, bearing silver platters that gleamed in the lamplight, their contents arranged with an attention to visual beauty that rivaled the finest works of art. The presentation of food became a form of theater, with elaborate garnishes and decorative elements that transformed simple nourishment into expressions of imperial magnificence. Peacocks might be served in their full plumage, reconstructed after cooking to create the illusion that living birds grace the imperial table. The emperor's own dining was a ceremony within a ceremony, as his food was served on golden plates, while musicians played compositions specifically created for different courses. His cupbearer, often a young man of noble birth who served in this capacity as a mark of special favor, followed rituals of presentation that elevated the simple act of drinking wine into a sacramental expression of imperial dignity. Between courses, entertainment was provided by performers whose skills had been honed to meet the exacting standards of imperial taste. Dancers whose movements told stories from classical mythology. Musicians who could perform compositions of extraordinary complexity. And poets who improvised verses celebrating the achievements of the current reign while subtly flattering the assembled guests. The clothing worn at these imperial gatherings represented another dimension of competitive display, as court fashion served not merely aesthetic purposes, but functioned as a complex system of communication about rank, wealth, and political allegiance. Picture the shimmering cascade of silk garments as hundreds of courtiers moved through the palace halls, each costume representing months of work by the empire's most skilled craftsmen and artisans. The emperor's own robes were marvels of textile art that incorporated materials and techniques from across the known world. Silk from China worked with gold thread from Nubia, decorated with pearls from the Persian Gulf, and gems from mines in distant provinces. The weight of these garments was considerable, requiring the emperor to move with measured dignity that enhanced his imperial presence while demonstrating his physical strength and endurance. But imperial fashion was not merely about display. It served practical political functions by creating visual hierarchies that reinforced social relationships and political loyalties. The color of one's robes, the type of decorative elements permitted, and even the quality of silk used were all regulated by imperial decree, creating a system where a glance could reveal an individual's exact position within the court hierarchy. Picture the empress and her ladies moving through these gatherings like living works of art, their gowns trailing behind them in carefully arranged folds that required teams of servants to maintain properly. Their jewelry alone represented the wealth of entire provinces. Tiaras that incorporated gems, whose names were known only to specialist gemologists, earrings that caught and reflected light with mathematical precision, and bracelets whose intricate craftsmanship demonstrated the empire's mastery over the finest decorative arts. The preparation required for these displays of magnificence was itself a complex undertaking that occupied entire workshops and employed hundreds of specialists. Imagine the careful coordination required to ensure that every element of imperial costume was perfect, from the invisible stitching that held elaborate decorations in place to the subtle perfumes that scented the fabrics, creating invisible clouds of exotic fragrance that announced imperial presence before the eye could identify its source. The Byzantine court calendar was structured around elaborate seasonal celebrations that provided opportunities for displays of imperial magnificence that grew more spectacular with each passing year. Picture the preparation that began months in advance of major festivals, as palace workshops created decorations and ceremonial objects that would be used once and then stored away or given as gifts to demonstrate imperial generosity. The celebration of Easter represented the pinnacle of imperial ceremony, combining religious solemnity with displays of wealth and power that demonstrated the emperor's role as God's representative on earth. Imagine processions through the palace halls that included not only the imperial family and highest court officials, but also representatives from every province of the empire, their exotic costumes and traditional gifts creating a living map of Byzantine dominion. The Christmas celebrations were equally magnificent, but followed different ceremonial patterns that emphasized the emperor's role as protector of Christian civilization. Picture banquets that lasted for days, with each evening featuring different themes and entertainment designed to showcase particular aspects of imperial culture and achievement. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed these celebrations returned to their own courts with tales of luxury and sophistication that enhanced the empire's reputation for civilized magnificence. The emperor's birthday provided opportunities for more personal expressions of imperial character, as the ceremonies could be tailored to reflect the particular interests and achievements of the current ruler. Military emperors might emphasize displays of martial prowess and the presentation of tribute from conquered territories, while emperors known for their scholarly interests might focus on literary competitions and philosophical discussions that demonstrated the intellectual sophistication of Byzantine court culture. Between these major celebrations, the court calendar was filled with smaller but equally elaborate observances that marked everything from religious feast days to the anniversaries of military victories. Each required its own specialized preparations and created opportunities for courtiers to demonstrate their loyalty and sophistication through their participation in the complex rituals that defined palace social life. The financial resources required to maintain this level of ceremonial magnificence represented a significant portion of the imperial budget, requiring careful coordination between palace administrators and provincial governors who provided the raw materials and luxury goods that made such displays possible. Picture the constant flow of exotic goods into Constantinople: spices from India, silk from China, gems from Ceylon, and precious metals from mines scattered across the empire and its trading partners. The maintenance of imperial workshops required not only expensive materials, but also the services of master craftsmen whose skills were so specialized that they might spend entire careers perfecting single techniques. These artisans lived comfortable lives under imperial patronage, but were carefully monitored to ensure that their techniques remained exclusive to imperial use, creating a system where the finest decorative arts served primarily to enhance imperial prestige rather than commercial profit. The logistics of imperial entertaining were equally complex, requiring coordination between multiple departments that managed everything from food procurement and preparation to the maintenance of mechanical devices and the training of ceremonial performers. Picture the careful planning required to ensure that every element of a major banquet functioned perfectly, from the timing of musical accompaniment to the synchronization of servant movements and the precise temperature at which different courses were served. The economic impact of this system extended far beyond the palace walls, as imperial demand for luxury goods stimulated trade networks that connected Constantinople with markets across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Provincial governors understood that their advancement might depend as much on their ability to provide exotic goods for imperial ceremonies as on their administrative competence or military achievements. The ultimate purpose of all this elaborate ceremonial was not mere self-indulgence, but the creation of psychological impressions that reinforced imperial authority and discouraged challenges to the established political order. Picture foreign ambassadors returning to their own courts with tales of mechanical marvels and unimaginable luxury, their reports serving as propaganda that enhanced the empire's reputation for power and sophistication. The effect on the Byzantine elite themselves was equally important, as participation in imperial ceremonies created bonds of shared experience and mutual obligation that strengthened the networks of personal loyalty upon which effective governance depended. Courtiers who had witnessed the emperor's magnificence found it psychologically difficult to imagine successful rebellion against such overwhelming demonstrations of power and resources. The religious dimensions of imperial ceremony were particularly significant, as the elaborate rituals served to reinforce the sacred nature of imperial authority while creating emotional experiences that connected political loyalty with spiritual devotion. Picture the profound psychological impact of witnessing ceremonies that seemed to blur the boundaries between earthly and heavenly authority, creating impressions that could influence behavior and belief for years afterward. Even the emperor himself was shaped by these elaborate performances, as the constant reinforcement of his elevated status could create a psychological distance from ordinary human concerns that both enhanced his authority and potentially isolated him from accurate information about conditions throughout his empire. The theater of power became a kind of beautiful prison that elevated its inhabitants while cutting them off from authentic human relationships. As the Byzantine Empire faced increasing military and financial pressures during its final centuries, the elaborate ceremonials that had once demonstrated imperial power began to reveal the underlying weakness of a state that could no longer afford the very displays that had once made it feared and admired throughout the known world. Picture the gradual simplification of court ceremonies, the reduction in the number of courses served at imperial banquets, and the replacement of gold vessels with silver ones as economic reality intruded upon ceremonial tradition. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 brought an abrupt end to a ceremonial tradition that had evolved over more than 1,000 years, as the new rulers had their own cultural traditions and saw little value in preserving the elaborate protocols of their Byzantine predecessors. The mechanical marvels of the throne room were dismantled, their precious materials recycled for Ottoman projects, while the golden vessels and silk hangings were either melted down or incorporated into the decoration of Turkish palaces. Yet something of the Byzantine genius for ceremonial magnificence survived in the protocols and traditions adopted by later European courts, as tales of Constantinople's vanished splendor inspired imitation and adaptation throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The idea that political power could be enhanced through carefully orchestrated displays of wealth and sophistication became a fundamental principle of royal courts from Versailles to the Kremlin. Let these images of vanished magnificence settle gently into the peaceful rhythm of your breathing as we prepare to bring our journey through the Byzantine world to its quiet conclusion. Rest easy, knowing that all human attempts at permanent grandeur ultimately return to dust, that even the most elaborate ceremonies cannot halt the gentle passage of time that transforms every palace into ruins and every emperor into memory. The golden birds have ceased their singing, the mechanical lions have fallen silent, and the great hall where emperors once dined now exists only in the realm of imagination and dream. But in that realm, the splendor remains eternal, waiting patiently for moments like these when we can visit once again the vanished world of silk and gold, of ceremony and power, of beauty and terror, intertwined in the endless human quest for meaning and permanence.